Creativity and storytelling for me are many things, but one of the things that comes to mind when I think about storytelling is what Joan Didion said in an interview that she had done. And she said, had I been blessed with even limited access to my own mind, there would have been no reason to write. I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. This quote by Joan Didion really resonated with me because it places writing in this larger context of the self. And the self is something that is constantly evolving, is constantly becoming. So, creativity is a process of engaging with the self in the same lines. I tend to be interested in a lot of different things at the same time. So, right now, even though I'm working on my next book and I am performing poetry, I've also started learning the ukulele, and I'm currently obsessed with Kabir folk songs. Now, Kabir is an individual who was very much this, proponent of storytelling through the spoken word. And his words have, passed down generations and generations across so many different cultures. And now with the internet, there could be anybody on any corner of the globe who has access to that. And I've just been listening to a lot of Kabir songs, and these ideas that he talks about, whether it's mortality or surrendering. I find a lot of this also influences my own writing practice and my own perspective on not necessarily what I'm writing, but how I'm writing. So there's that. In addition, creativity is very much about making connections between uh, the external world and the internal world. The memoir as a genre is able to do that beautifully because we talk in memoirs or personal essays about who we are, but we do it while discussing people or experiences that we have had, places we've been to, memories that we're accessing, dialogues or stories that we've heard passed down to us through our grandparents or our parents, songs that we've engaged with. So there's this really expansive way that a memoir has of bringing all of these different worlds together. And a memoir is able to do it in a way that feels vulnerable and feels authentic to a writer's voice. So creativity currently is taking that form for me. It's taking the form of memoir, and I include poetry, whether it's page poetry or spoken word poetry, within that larger umbrella of memoir.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Closet Writer Chronicles. I'm your host Sangeeta, aka the Moody Marshmallow. You just heard our guest for today, Pragya Bhagat. Pragya is an award-winning essayist and spoken word poet. Her work has been featured in The Wire, BBC, Muse India, The Huffington Post, Helter Skelter, and many more publications. She is the author of 2 memoirs, Yarn and Swimming in Our Oceans. Before all this, Pragya was a biology major at the University of Texas, Austin, and she went on to do a master's in Dalit and tribal social work from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Join us as we unpack Pragya's journey and her take on writing and creativity. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Closet Writer Chronicles. This week I have with me Pragya Bhagat. This is extremely special because I have been a part of Pragya's poetry writing and non-fiction classes. So it's really cool for me to be able to talk to a mentor of mine. Hi Pragya, so good to have you here.
Hi, Sangeeta. Thanks for having me.
So Pragya, the first thing I want to ask you is what is your earliest memory of being creative and when did you start writing?
Creativity can be defined in a lot of ways, and for the sake of our conversation, I'm defining it as the ability to play, to take whatever we're observing in the world around us and to make connections in a form that is enjoyable. So, my earliest memories of doing that would probably be around the ages of, I want to say, 4 or 5. I was living in Bulgaria at the time. My dad was posted there for his work, and I used to take these Bharatnatyam classes. And I remember wearing this chunni, this sort of white veil, and just playing around with it and dancing, even though there was no music. So that was one memory. And another memory that I have of being creative is taking the leaves of trees and mashing them up and making this pretend tea, which I think a lot of us did, right? Like I think for me as a young girl, I was imitating what I was seeing around me. I was imitating what I saw my mother doing, what I saw other women, older girls or older women in my life doing, and a lot of that was focused around this idea of serving and nurturing and cooking. And so I remember pretending to do that or trying to mimic them when I was younger. And that to me is a form of creativity because I was playing based on the knowledge that I was given. Now,
Hmm.
as far as words are concerned, that happened not too much later. I want to say around the age of 7. I was in second grade. At this point, I was in San Francisco. And there was a teacher of mine. Her name was Miss French. And she wrote a journal prompt on a board and she gave us a notebook and we just had to respond to the prompt. I don't remember what the prompt was, but we would journal every single day as part of our, you know, day, as part of our classroom time. And I used to love doing that because I felt like this was me talking to myself and no one else knew what I was saying. So I felt very much like a safe space. That's how writing started out for me, as a safe space, um, a place where I felt like I could truly be myself without these sort of external cultural norms that even at an early age I could feel were being imposed on me. So both creativity and writing sort of went hand in hand, but in terms of play, it happened in different forms, whether it was through dance or art or just using my hands. And the writing was something that started as a form of self expression.
Mm. No, that's really interesting. I had a guest on earlier in the season, Roni Kejriwal, who runs the Alipore Post. So she was also talking about, how she incorporates play in everything. And that's how kind of her creative journey also started. So it's really interesting to hear your take on it as well, because I could see a few similarities there, which was really interesting. But also, while growing up, there are always, writers or artists who kind of impact you in a certain way. And I think, especially when you are a writer, I feel like sometimes there are, certain books you read or certain things you come across that really stay with you and sort of inspire you to create your own things. Who have those writers or artists been for you, or even just stories, in terms of books, films, music, spoken word, poetry, what and who have they been for you?
My influences have changed based on the phase of life that I was in, right? So I remember as a kid, even as an adult for that matter, but especially as a kid, I used to love Dr. Seuss. Just the fact that
Okay.
there were these beautiful pictures combined with these really fun rhymes. Now that I read let's say, the Lorax as an adult, it holds so much more meaning. Or Green Eggs and Ham, or The Cat in the Hat, or, I could go on and on and on. And so Dr. Seuss was one of my earliest influences, and even the poems that I used to write as a kid, there was a lot of just this sort of like quick rhyming storytelling situation that I was trying to imitate that he used to do. I was also a big fan of Madeline Engel in my adolescent years. Um, Her ability to create these very believable fantasy worlds and have these children as the protagonists, I thought that was really amazing. I remember reading Madeline. I remember reading A Wrinkle in Time and thinking, oh, like kids can also be heroes and heroines of a story. That's really cool. Um, so there was that. I think as I got older, spoken word poetry started becoming more important to me, based on my exposure to people like Sarah Kay, Staceyann, who's this very powerful, half Jamaican, half Asian queer spoken word poet. And her words were just like bullets. Like they would come out very different style from Sarah Kay. Sarah Kay is very mellow, beautiful, gentle, but still impactful. And Stacey Anchin was all pow, 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 pow. So there was just a lot that I was consuming hearing wise. And the more I consumed it, the more I began to realize the importance of words as having rhythm and of silence as being just as important as the words. And that I would say happened in my mid to late teens, that interest in spoken word poetry. In terms of other literary influences, currently I tend to read a lot. I mean, I've always been reading a lot, but especially now after the pandemic, I just reading has been such an integral part of my life. And I've been focusing particularly on women of color, not just poetry, but prose, fiction as well as nonfiction. And yet, there are certain books that I can keep revisiting and reading again and again. And one of those books that's really been formative for me, well, there's two. One is Flowers for Algernon, and the other one is Narcissus and Goldmund by Hermann Hesse,
Okay.
who's most well known for Siddhartha. Both of these books have just left such a big impact on me because the stories that these authors are able to tell evoke just incredible levels of emotion every time I read them, regardless of where I am in my life. And I think that's what I strive to do in how I'm finding my voice as a writer and as a poet, as an essayist. I feel emotion is this universal language that crosses all sorts of barriers. And so regardless of what the story is, who the characters are, where they're set, if I am able to feel a certain level of grief or joy or curiosity or jealousy, and I'm able to communicate that through any sort of narrative, that to me is the greatest power of storytelling. And so these particular authors, I feel, have done that particularly well.
No, that's amazing. And I think just to like pivot slightly from what you said, because I'm curious. I know since you also like teach writing workshops, and of course you've written two books yourself. Um, how how has it been for you in terms of developing your own, writing voice, especially since you consume so much? Do you ever find that you're possibly subconsciously maybe sometimes even mimicking, the things you're reading and consuming? Because I know that happens with me sometimes. Like, I don't even realize it till I'm reading it later and I'm like, wait, why does this sound like a writer I just recently read? So I'm just curious to know how that's been for you.
I am very much in the same boat. I not just in terms of what I read, but even in terms of the music that I listen to or the shows that I'm watching. I'm very much a product of what I am surrounded by, what I am actively consuming, or what I am passively absorbing. So currently, I've been on a hip hop spree. I've been listening to a lot of Kendrick Lamar and just listening to this one album of his, Damn, just again and again and again and again. And I'm constantly blown away by, again, how he uses rhythm, by how he uses breath and rhyme and just the lyrics to communicate his rage or to communicate his vulnerability in his songs and his rap songs. And there's so then that is something I end up doing in the work that I create. So it's very much, yeah, it's very much a product of what I'm consuming. I just finished finally watching Breaking Bad after like a
Oh,
gazillion years,
okay.
and I am just, you know, I am this
In
channeling
that
this.
world.
I'm in that world of like cynicism, but at the same time, this whole Jesse Pinkman like soulful naivete, and then Skylar's frustration and her navigating, you know, all these spaces. I'm very, and I'm not able to let go of it. I'm not able to let go of Breaking Bad. Like I'm still holding on to it. But yeah, like I'm definitely, I don't want to use the word victim, but I think it is a process. Finding my voice is a process of um, choosing what I want to be influenced by. And sometimes that
Hmm.
is an active choice, and more often than not, it is not an active choice. But it is something I've accepted, it is something I'm not resisting. And this idea of a writer's voice, at least in what I've read from interviews of other writers or other poets, it's something that my understanding is you cannot force it. It will emerge.
Hmm.
And so one thing that I am trying to do is just consume different types of art. And the hope is that over time it becomes distilled into something that is some version of me.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting. So I want to read this excerpt from Swimming in Our Oceans because I think it kind of merges perfectly with the next thing I want to ask you. So the excerpt is this. By 2006, I had a bachelor's in biology and a teaching degree. I had worked as a research assistant on Middle Eastern studies, a researcher on grasshoppers, a curriculum developer at a nature preserve, and a science teacher, all by the age of 23. Okay, so that's the excerpt. And I know after that you did go on to even study at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. You got a master's there in Dalit and tribal social work. And you're also a yoga teacher. So, how do career decisions happen for you? I'm very curious. Like, how do you kind of go about figuring, the path you have now is obviously very different from so many things you've sort of traversed through. So, how do career decisions happen for you?
They don't. There is no idea of a career. I think I broke that notion very early on. I think I was like 19 or 20. Prior to that, I had very much been a I know what I want to be when I grow up, and I'm gonna work towards that. And then I grew up and I realized I wanted to be so much more. So, all of these different experiences that I've had are just a result of me being curious and being interested in a lot of different things. I am by no means a master at all of these things, but I think doing these different sorts of jobs, which a lot of this was during my time at UT Austin when I was majoring in biology. So there were opportunities in the scientific field, but I also was interested in teaching. I was also interested in curriculum design. I was also interested in learning about what other women in academics were doing, which is where all of these different, work gigs sort of came about. And yeah, at the end of the day, it just boils down to if I'm curious about something, I will immerse myself in it. Writing has been one of those things, but it is by no means the only thing that I enjoy doing or that I enjoy learning about. At the same time, it's there is this restlessness in me. Perhaps it is a product of having flitted from one place to another my whole life, or perhaps it is just a product of who I am. I'm not sure. And at this point, that's not really what I'm trying to figure out. What I've realized is I find a lot of value in learning new things because it allows me to add another layer to my sense of self. And instead of trying to limit my sense of self to I am this or I am that, I'm just trying to be many things.
No, that's amazing. I feel like you're trying to really live up to, I think, your fullest potential in a way. I think being whatever you think you can be, which I think is really cool. But then, having said that, writing is again like a huge part of that whole narrative. When did you realize that, writing was something you could pursue professionally instead of just being something that was so personal that you could actually maybe convert it to a career path and, work on that?
I'd always been writing. So these other things that I've done, whether it's dance or music or taking some sort of course because I want to learn something, these things have come and gone. Writing, on the other hand, has been, there's no other way to put it, it's been my longest relationship. And so I'd always done it, I'd just not considered pursuing it as a craft until 2015. So in
Okay.
2015, I was working with Teach for India. I was training fellows and building program design. And I had started toying with this idea of, well, what if I were to write? And what if I were to write a book? Or what if I were to pursue this as something more than just a hobby? And then during the course of that year, I actually ended up getting a promotion as well. However, there was still this nagging feeling inside me that got louder and louder. And this feeling, this voice was saying, if you don't do this now, if you don't take the plunge now, then when will you? And I just sort of went for it. And in 2016, I quit my job. I moved to this village in Uttarakhand, which is where this book, Swimming in Our Oceans, is set, and decided to become a writer. And I didn't know what
Wow.
that meant. All I knew was that I wanted to live in a place that didn't have a lot of distractions, and a village in the Himalayas does not have a lot of distractions. And I wanted to write a book. So that's sort of all I had at that point, and I just went with it. Writing for me has also been a huge learning opportunity, and it continues to be because I haven't done any sort of master's in writing. I've studied other things. So, whatever I've learned has been by reading other books or by engaging in the process of publishing, working with different kinds of publishers, writing proposals, submitting work to literary magazines, to competitions, mostly getting rejections, and then over time getting more and more acceptances. So that whole process of being a writer has been equally frustrating and equally gratifying, but I would have it no other way.
No, but that's really cool. So, what was your first like writing gig then? Like the first thing you ever wrote and like you made money out of it. You're like, oh my God, I can totally do this as a career.
Mm, that's a good question. What was the first thing I made money out of writing? I want to say I'd submitted a poem. Actually, I'd submitted a set of poems to this Irish magazine,
Oh,
and they had accepted it, and then they paid me. And I don't even remember how much it was. It wasn't a lot, but just the fact that they paid me made me feel really, uh, really validated. Like,
yeah.
oh, like, okay, my dad isn't the only one who thinks I write well. Huh, what do you know about that? So over time, it's been these little things. And I think to this day, every time I have an opportunity to write and to get paid what I write, it still feels it still feels very much like the first time. I still get giddy and I still show it to my mom and show it to my friends, and yeah, it's a great feeling. It's almost like
Yeah.
it's like chasing a high,
Yeah.
getting published.
Oh yeah, that it definitely is. I agree to that for sure. But it's interesting because since you mentioned this in your previous answer about kind of facing rejection, right, to before getting to where you are today. Um, I think what has that been like for you in terms of, obviously, I'm sure, I think every writer goes through this. There is a certain amount of rejection you inevitably face. It usually doesn't happen where your first piece of work is accepted and you're published. At least I've not heard too many stories like that. But what has your sort of trajectory been like with rejection? How have you sort of dealt with it? And do you think you're much better dealing with it now?
I've always been all right. I've been okay with disappointment. I mean, disappointment has happened and continues to happen in our lives. It takes different forms. So it's never been like a soul crushing thing. But what I have done is I've gone into this practice of writing with a plan. It is a very loose
Hmm.
plan, but the plan is that I'm going to keep doing it for as long as I'm alive. And I'm in this for the long haul. So I'm doing it now in my 30s, and I'm going to continue to do it in my 40s and my 50s and my 60s and my 70s. And honestly, with the kind of food we're eating and the air we're breathing, I don't know if I'm going to go beyond 70. But the idea is that I'm in this for the long run. So progress is not getting less rejections, but progress is getting more acceptances. And it could
Hmm.
take different forms. Acceptances does not necessarily look like publishing in a literary magazine all the time. Acceptances, for example, this year there have been a lot of opportunities for me that have come my way where I've gotten to just perform poetry. And these are things I have not pursued, but they have come, and they've come because I've been doing this for a few years now. So it's taken that form. Acceptances could also mean being commissioned to cover the International Film Festival of Goa, for example, which happened a few months ago. I have these spreadsheets that I make. I have a lot of spreadsheets. I like keeping things organized, which is interesting because I'm not a very planny person. But I have
Okay.
these spreadsheets, and on each spreadsheet is for a year, and on each spreadsheet I have these different columns which list everything I've published, and these rows which list what I have sent these submissions to. Red means rejection, green means acceptance. So if you look at my spreadsheet from 2018, it's just red, 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 red.
Oh,
And
wow.
then one or two greens. And then if you look at the one from 2019, there's a little more green. 2020 is a little more green. So that's what I mean by progress. I'm not looking to um, end this process anytime soon. And for me, it is a craft, it is a skill. I am constantly striving to be as good as I can be in this skill. I have a long way to go, and I'm enjoying the learning. So rejection for me, as frustrating as it can be, is part of that learning. It
Yeah.
definitely feels shitty at times, but I take it in its stride, and I try not to dwell on it too much because it's part of the process. And if anything, it's just going to continue to push me. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, more power to you. And I mean, you've already written two books and you've been published in a variety of magazines and other publications. So it's just exciting to see you kind of grow, right, as a writer and see the different kinds of things you come out with. But now that you are sort of professionally a writer, Do you think that's kind of changed your relationship with writing, since you now kind of do monetize it in a sense? Like, because a lot of times people say that the minute they convert their passion into a profession, it becomes very different, the way they sort of interact with it. So how has your relationship changed, if it's changed at all?
My relationship with writing has changed in one big way ever since I decided to look at it as work. And what's happened is now I have rituals around writing, which I did not have before. So
Hmm.
prior to making the shift to becoming a writer, I would write when inspiration struck me or when I was feeling particularly creative. What happens now is it is part of my routine to write every single day because I look at it as work. Having said that, it is not work in the sense that I don't want to do it. I still want to do it. There are days when I don't know what to write. There are days when maybe I'm having menstrual cramps, or maybe I'm just feeling anxious, or maybe I don't feel like getting out of bed. So there are swings and changes in the ebb and flow of daily life. Um, but the writing always manages to be an anchor through it all. And that's happened because of these rituals that I've built, or the discipline that I've built around engaging with it.
You mentioned rituals. I'm kind of curious to know. Like, so then do you have like a proper routine in terms of around your work, or just being disciplined in terms of, okay, I will write so much every day?
I journal every morning, so that's sort of how I get whatever needs to be purged out in the beginning of the day. And I write for a certain number of hours every day. For me, it's not so much about the output as much as it is about engaging with the process. So I might, let's say, if I write for 4 hours, of those 4 hours, it is very possible that for 3 of those hours, I will come up with 100 words, or there'll just be a lot of chicken scratching on the page. So, in terms of quantity, that's never been the measure for me. I think with writing books, there's a lot of putting in the work every single day, whether it's an hour, whether it's 15 minutes, or whether it's more, but just taking each day at a time. And then over time, what ends up happening is, you have all of this material to work with. I also edit my work every day. So, for example, I could be working on a prose piece. I could also be working on a poem. So, one day, if I want to work more on editing, I could perhaps edit the poem and write less. But I sit with my pen and my paper and my laptop for 3 to 4 hours every day and do this. Another ritual that I engage with while writing is drinking coffee. So,
Okay.
my coffee, I tend to sip it very slowly, and I take it black and like really strong. And after 30 minutes, it's practically at room temperature, which is fine. But I keep writing as long as my coffee lasts. So when the
Oh,
coffee is
wow.
finished, the writing for the day is finished. Yeah, so I'm a very slow coffee drinker, is basically what I'm saying.
Oh my God, that's so interesting. Have you ever, and I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask, but then have you ever tried writing after drinking? Because I know there's some writers who have experimented with after like drinking alcohol and then writing. Is that something you've ever tried? And has that worked for you?
I've never done it. I've never, with any sort of I mean, caffeine is probably the only substance I've taken and written, but with any other substances, I've never been able to write. And
Hmm.
there are a lot of, right, Hemingway, is the most
Yeah.
famous example where he would drink and write. But for me, it feels blocking. It creates
Hmm.
blockages if I consume these substances. I feel less focused. I feel like I'm in less of a flow. Um, and it's just, yeah, it's never worked for me, and I kind of like it. I like it that way. Writing for me is very much a sacred space, and
Yeah.
at the risk of sounding, I don't know, moralistic or old fashioned or like a classicist, I don't want to uh, corrupt that space with
Yeah.
these substances. So it's just water and caffeine for me while writing for now.
No, but that's really fascinating to just hear about, what you sort of follow through to kind of make sure you're getting writing done every single day. But, you also spoke about spoken word. That is something you have been doing for the past couple of years now. You even, I think, most recently you performed for Alok with Menon's tour when he was in Goa for Commune, when he was doing his India tour, which was really cool. How did you get into spoken word? What sort of piqued your interest, and when did you say that, hey, I'd like to try this out and see where it takes me?
Funnily enough, my spoken word journey started with Commune. I
Oh,
had heard about them, and this was when I was living in Uttarakhand, and they'd put out a call for submissions, and I submitted a piece to them, and they liked it, and they brought me over to Delhi. They had a show there that they were curating, and so I performed for them, and it felt terrifying. It felt terrifying to be in front of, I want to say there were like 30 or 40 people in the audience, but I was I was quite mortified, but that felt it felt very thrilling to be able to communicate my truth and to communicate it with an audience in real time, which
hmm.
page poetry doesn't allow, or publishing in a literary magazine, or even publishing a book, it doesn't allow that sort of instant response. So it was a very different feeling of being in front of these individuals who are strangers, and telling them something really vulnerable about myself. And what followed immediately after the performance is, these people came up to me, and they communicated these things that resonated with them. That, oh, I've also experienced this sense of how it was a poem called Narcissism, which I believe
Okay.
is up on YouTube. And they communicated that, this part really resonated with me, or I really liked how you put this, and I thought it was so beautiful. And I've also felt these insecurities that you've described. So it allowed me to connect with people in a way that otherwise I would not have been able to connect with. And I wanted to continue exploring that. So just like with these other sort of, Middle Eastern studies or working with grasshoppers, this started as an idea that I wanted to explore, and a different facet of playing with words that I wanted to explore. And now it's become this thing which is very much a part of my life. I think poetry has influenced my prose writing or my memoir writing in many ways. One, of course, is just hearing the sound of words, seeing where I want to breathe, where I want the sentence to breathe. These are facets that have come to me, or that I started thinking about because of the role that spoken word has played in my life.
That's amazing. I mean, the fact that, you started listening to, spoken word artists, and then you've kind of gone on to now do the same thing in a sense in your own way, right? That's so cool. And I think it's great that you've come full circle with Commune, that you started with them. And again, this year you got to perform with them again, which is really great. So, as I mentioned, you've written two memoirs, one being Yarn, which is about your maternal grandmother, if I'm right, and also where you kind of reflect on your own life by talking about, her life in a sense, and your latest one, Swimming in Our Oceans, which is about your move to Uttarakhand and, life thereafter. Um, is there a specific process you follow for, memoir writing? And were they very similar or vastly different for both these books?
That's a good question. With the first book, with Yarn, I knew the seed of the story that I wanted to start with. And the seed was my nani, my maternal grandmother, and her journey from Pakistan to India during the partition. She's been somebody in our family who's always called the shots. She's a matriarch of sorts, if you can say. So I've had her as well as my mother and my aunts as very strong, fierce female role models. And I wanted to tell my Nani's story. That's what the book began as. What it turned into was not just my Nani's story, but the story of how my family came to be my family, how these women came to be who they are, and as a result, how I came to be who I am. It is a family memoir. So it is a memoir about my nani, but because it's a family memoir, I think my primary reason for writing the book was I wanted to document the story of my family. So that was the
Okay.
process that Yarn sort of took. And swimming in our oceans was quite different process wise when I was writing it. So it started out as me living in this village in Uttarakhand and just writing every day. I didn't even know it would turn into a book, but there were all these experiences that I was having for the very first time, like putting out a forest fire or seeing people die in front of my eyes, or turning into a dog person, or even understanding my mental health in this space which was so vast and silent but also claustrophobic at the same time. So there were all these different experiences that I was naturally documenting as a way of understanding myself. And it was only after I'd left Uttarakhand, or I was sort of already on the verge of leaving, that I decided that I wanted to shape this into a book, uh, and tell a particular version of these events that took place during my first year living in the mountains.
That's nice. That how do you sort of decide how much to share in a memoir? Because I feel like sometimes, I mean, obviously, when you're writing, say, a first draft or something, it's whatever really comes out, and it can be a lot sometimes. So then, how do you sort of decide that? Okay, I only want to put out this much. Anything more would just be way too vulnerable and too much, even for maybe a reader to take on, or even just for me to put out. So, how do you kind of set those boundaries?
I'm still figuring that out. I don't know what
Okay.
those boundaries are. I focused focused in the first book on what I believe is a much more limited version of my story, or of the story of my family. And in this second book, swimming in our oceans, I've delved deeper. So I've sort of allowed more of myself to be visible. Having said
Mm.
that, there's still parts of myself that I don't know if I want to share with the world, and perhaps that will change. Perhaps that won't. At this point, I don't know. But what I do know is that the genre of memoir allows for really powerful storytelling, but the key has to be the story. So
Mm.
often, what has in the editing process, what happens is I will have what I think are just like great bits of dialogue, or just, a really great amount of detail or descriptions. And after distancing myself from the work, and when I revisit it and I look at the work, it will feel like a bit of TMI, and it will feel like this is not necessarily adding to the narrative. So just like with editing any sort of story, I do look at it with the lens of, is this relevant to these characters? So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, more than myself, there are other individuals who are portrayed as characters in these books. And these characters are still alive, and these characters are people who are important to me and I have relationships with. So part of the editing process is sharing drafts of these chapters or sharing drafts of the manuscript with these individuals and asking them, hey, this is something I want to put out in the world. Are you comfortable with this? What are you not comfortable with? And engaging in that dialogue with them. And more often than not, they are okay with putting those versions of themselves out there, but sometimes they're not. And in that case, I will, tweak bits here and there because I don't want to alienate people. At the same time,
Hmm.
I do want to be an effective storyteller. So it's trying to, I guess I'm trying to find the balance between that. If anything, the boundaries lay more with my interaction with these other people who are portrayed as characters in my books.
Hmm. Okay. Oh, that's actually really informative to know. Uh, in terms of actually, writing a memoir. I didn't even think about the fact of actually asking people you're writing about. So when you brought it up, I was like, oh yeah, good point. You should actually check if you are writing about someone else as well. But also, you do one of the things that Swimming in Our Oceans covers, which you've mentioned, is about belonging and identity in a sense. What has your relationship with identity and belonging like, considering that you've moved around a lot while growing up, even just generally throughout life? You do talk about moving from place to place. So what has that been like for you?
Identity is a word I am trying to peel away from. I'm not
Okay.
doing it very successfully, but the reason I say that is because it it implies a definition. It implies some sort of mold that either I'm putting myself into or I'm shaping for myself. So that's an idea which I'm trying to distance myself from. Having said that, it is a pursuit, right? This figuring, this becoming, it's always happening in different forms. I want to talk more about this idea of belonging because
Hmm.
home has taken on and continues to take on these different layers for me. So there is, of course, the geographical aspect of it. I've spent most of my childhood living in one country for 3 years and then another country for 3 years and so on until the age of 15. Then we immigrated to Texas and I spent about a decade of my life there. Then I decided to move to India by myself and I spent another have I continue to live in India, but it's been around 10 years now that I've been in India as well. And within the subcontinent, I've also been in one place for a few years, then another place for a few years. So this geographical aspect is something that hasn't really been an anchor. If anything, it's led to this sense of, I mean, curiosity, yes, adaptability, yes, but it's also led to the realization that home can never be a physical space.
Hmm.
Um, I find myself turning more and more inward where this idea of home is concerned, or this idea of belonging is concerned. One of the things that I mention in Swimming in Our Oceans is when I decided to shift to the hills, I thought that it would bring me an inner peace because I'm going to be in this sort of externally peaceful environment. And what ended up happening during my time in Kumaon was quite the opposite. I became much more attuned to the anxiety within myself and to the restlessness and the disquiet that existed within me. So it just brought to light that changing a physical space is not going to change what's happening internally. So there's that. There's also this other element of cultural belonging, right? So I am I say technically because I don't identify as someone from Delhi, but I'm technically a person from Delhi. It's where I was born. My parents are Punjabi. I am a very pseudo Punjabi. I don't speak the language. I've never lived there. I've spent most of my education in these American international schools, and I used to live in Texas. So there is this element of being American, of
Yeah.
inhabiting these American values, or just like things that I will not notice, but my friends here are like, oh, like you say this word this way, or you look at this particular situation in this way, and that's not how we do it because we've grown up in a very different culture. At the same time, when I go visit my folks in Austin who are still living there, I feel the sense of outsiderness there as well. I don't feel like there is enough American in me to fit in there either. And so that's sort of been a struggle, a sort of a seesaw sort of situation for most of my life. And this is also why I say that I'm trying to veer away from this idea of identity, because calling myself Indian American or American Indian really doesn't serve any purpose in defining me. I am defined by as much expansiveness or as much limitation as I want to bring on myself. So it's something that culturally also I am now just inhabiting. I'm just inhabiting this in between space. And I'm also connecting it to this idea of being a writer, of being a storyteller.
Hmm.
It's a storyteller is somebody who observes, often from the sidelines, sometimes from within the action, but I'm somebody who looks at situations and experiences and listens to others from this perspective of this is a story that's unfolding. Even when I'm doing it, with myself, if I'm like cooking, sometimes there'll be a running dialogue in my head, which is how would I describe this if I had to describe it in words? So that observational aspect of inhabiting space is something that I am now embracing. And I think that will create a sense of being an outsider in whichever situation I put myself in. So, geographical, cultural, um, yoga is something that you mentioned, and yoga is a practice that I've been deepening my relationship with. So, there is also
Okay.
this spiritual aspect of home where I'm trying to understand the connection between my body and my mind in a stronger way. This, of course, yoga is one tool to do that. There are things like mushrooms, which are another way to do that. And I think that both of these um, experiences have led to the same, like therapy also, they sort of lead to the same space, which is that change is the only constant, and that understanding the self is how one then begins to understand the world around them. So I'm currently inhabiting that zone. I'm currently trying to do a lot of just figuring by engaging in yoga and that
Okay.
practice. And there is no outcome that I'm really looking for, but what I'm finding is it's leading my body to do more of the work, which previously I pushed my mind to do. There is this tendency that we have to like intellectualize things, but sometimes like you can just trust the body and trust the breath to figure things out, and those things can't necessarily be articulated.
Hmm. Speaking of the body, I know you also talk a lot about body image in your writing and even mental health. Um, so, again, even with regard to those themes, what is your sort of relationship or take on those? Because again, I feel like, again, there's like a very strong correlation there, because your mind can really affect your body and vice versa. So what has mental health and body image been like for you?
Writing has been the it was the first tool that I had to articulate um, struggles or challenges that I faced with regard to my perception of my body. Um,
Hmm.
like many teenage girls, I hated the way that I looked. I hated the color of my skin, especially living in Austin where everybody else was white. I felt this sense of um, just like rejection, like everything about me should be rejected. And I think that also then led to me finding external validation not through my physicality but by using my mind and focusing on this whole like academic excellence bit, which I think is something a lot of immigrant children become subject to. Anyhow, as I grew older, they just writing allowed me, whether it was journaling or telling stories, it allowed me to um, understand that what the other women in my life were telling me about, oh, don't go in the sun, you'll get darker, or your hair is not straight enough, or you're too skinny, or you're too this, or you're too that. What they were telling me was a product of how they had been raised and the shackles that they have been bound by. So my relationship with my body has changed and continues to change as my relationship with feminism continues to change.
Hmm.
I recently read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. I had, referenced it during my master's, but I'd never read the whole book. And it's like this huge, brilliant, brilliant tome of a book, which is a weapon. It's a weapon against society. And in it, Beauvoir sheds this spotlight on what it means to be the other and how fundamentally we as women have absorbed this idea of being the other. So even if it is something as simple as I'm walking on the street, I am seeing myself as a man would see me. Or if I am in a train, I am seeing myself in a physical space as as an indicator of like safety. So if
Yeah.
I don't feel safe, it is because there are these people around me, or how much space am I taking, how much space am I not taking. These are questions or ideas that Beauvoir really just what's the word, brought home in a very big way. So there's that aspect. I think body image continues to be a a struggle. Like there are days when I will wake up and I will feel like I just do not want to present myself to the world. But it is a changing relationship. This year, in fact, I'm trying. I'm doing this thing where I'm trying to be kinder to myself. I don't know exactly what that means, but every time this inner critic says something about my physicality or about how I feel that I look, I will try and be kind to that inner critic. There's that aspect, and this kindness also extends to my mental health. Last
Okay.
year, I was this was during the second wave of the pandemic. I was diagnosed with what is called borderline personality, and prior to that, I had also discovered that I had this condition called misophonia, which is a neurobehavioral condition in which certain sounds activate my fight or flight response. And these are usually sounds that are made by people who I've spent a great deal of time with. For example, my mother or my father. So people that are important to me, that I care about. What that's done is it's made it's always made living with them and finding ways of regulating my emotions with them challenging. And
Hmm.
what I am trying to do now is, instead of fighting it, because I have an understanding of what is happening, I'm trying to find ways to live with that while continuing to foster and develop a relationship with my parents. So the triggers never really go away, but there is a way to, continue to live with these triggers in my life. So that's something that I'm trying to do. And I want to bring it back to yoga. I feel like yoga has played a big role in my ability to regulate my emotions. I still have a long way to go, but I can see a huge difference from 1 month to the next, or 1 year to the next, as far as that's concerned. Mental health is something that I have written a lot more about in Swimming in Our Oceans, which is my second book. With the
Hmm.
first book, I didn't have the vocabulary really to articulate what it was that was happening with me. And another thing that I want to talk about here is, um, there is there are two sets of beliefs, right? One is that, okay, you had this diagnosis and you like live with these labels, and you find a way to live day to day knowing that these labels exist in your life. The other way to look at it is say that, you know what, diagnoses are limiting. We don't need words um, to tell us how we're feeling. And so, actually, we should live life without these diagnoses and without any medications for people who need them. I currently am in a space in between these two zones. So, while I have this vocabulary that allows me to understand what is happening to me, I don't want to use these words or these ideas as a form of my identity, right? Bringing it back to
Hmm.
this idea of like limiting oneself. I understand more about how my mind works. I understand more about my relationship with these individuals in my life and with my relationship with myself. And there is just so much work that can be done um, to to live a life that is fruitful and engaging and productive and functional, keeping these things in mind. So I don't want to ignore them, but I also don't want to become them. There is this risk
Hmm.
of saying, oh, I have, borderline personalities, so it means that there are these issues and these issues define who I am. No. I decide the story that I want to tell about myself, and that story has these words in my dictionary, but there is so much more in that dictionary as well. And so writing is a way of expanding that dictionary and expanding what that narrative is.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing, and more power to you. I'm sure listeners will really get like a whole new perspective on this, and I think it's just a lot more awareness, and it's important to have these conversations and have people talk about these things. So thank you so much for putting yourself out there like that, the way you do with your writing, and whatever it is you do. So now we're sort of coming towards the end of this interview, and we always end with these last two questions. So the first one is, what are your aspirations currently? What are you looking forward to in the near or even distant future?
Well, I am working on my next book. I'm very
Oh, great.
excited, very excited about that. In fact, I started working on it the day I finished Swimming in Our Oceans, because what else is there
Oh.
to do except write? I'm not going to sit around waiting. So I don't yet know what it is about. It is in the same sort of genre. So there are personal essays, there is poetry. It is still in the process of becoming. So I'll leave it at that. But I'm excited about it because creation is always an exciting part of the writing process. So there's that. In terms of aspirations, I am just so grateful that I get to write every day. I love doing it. It brings me just so much. I cannot explain how much joy it brings me to be able to do that. And I want to continue to do that day after day and day after day. Having said that, writing does not always pay the bills. So my current aspiration is also trying to find a job which pays me a salary so that I can continue doing what it is that I love to do. So that's sort of where I'm currently at professionally.
Okay, and finally, what is a piece of advice or learning that you'd like to share? It can be creative, personal, professional, just something you've sort of learned and experienced for yourself, and you wish more people were aware of.
If you see writing as a craft that you want to work on, there is no question about it. It must be seen as work. Work can be fun, work cannot be fun, but if writing is something you want to be excellent at, you have to see writing as work. And work
Yeah.
requires you to show up. Work requires you to be your own boss. Work requires you to have a sense of discipline. That discipline could be different for different people, but it is important. While it is important to be kind to oneself, I do believe that it is just as important to be assertive and to be just really driven with whatever that passion is. And what I have found really worked for me is embedding rituals in my day. Rituals help me to build that discipline. So even when I don't feel that inner drive, a ritual is an external drive that will push me to write.
Thank you so much. On that wonderful note, we have come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for being here, Pragya. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
The pleasure is all mine. I had a blast. Thank you.
So that was my conversation with Pragya Bhagat. I loved recording this and getting a deeper insight to Pragya's process as a writer. Closing this episode with an excerpt from Pragya's memoir, Swimming in Our Oceans, narrated by her. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next week with a new guest and a new chronicle to share. Talk soon!
I'm going to read an excerpt from Swimming in Our Oceans. The book has personal essays, but it also has poetry that I've written. And this particular piece that I'm reading is a poem. When we meet for the first time, I will ask you what you do, and you will ask me where I'm from, and then I'll offer you two versions, the long one or the short one. If you choose the short version, I will tell you that I am from nowhere and I am from everywhere. That, like Sita, I was born of the soil, and there I shall return, because this land, not people, determine where I belong. If I were to walk across the earth, won't I eventually, hypothetically, end up where I started, thus proving that we are all connected despite the wars and walls and lines on maps that try to disconnect us? This is the short version. But if you choose the long version, I will tell you that I am from nowhere and I am from everywhere. That till the age of 15, home wasn't a place. Home was shells and stamps and stones I strung onto a necklace of stories because they slid on easily. People were harder to fit. So I listened to their music and shelved the lyrics in my ribs. And when we moved, I blew out their music like a deflated balloon. People, I will tell you, left me breathless. But people were also marvelous monsoons, dangerous and unpredictable. I wanted nothing but to soak in their storm. I've lived in the west and the east, in mountains and valleys, in villages and cities. It doesn't matter where I stay. A restless voice always pulls me away. It snows too much, the voice will say. There's not enough rain. It costs too much. The people here can't pronounce my name. But I'd be lying if I blamed anyone but myself. I don't belong, but that doesn't mean I don't try to. I've always wondered what it's like to grow up in the same place with the same people, to kiss the boy I once played hide and seek with, to climb into wheelchairs with those I once climbed trees with. If I was Goldilocks and I could squeeze and tweak and pluck my walk to be desi enough, modern enough, my talk to be local enough, global enough, my skin to be brown enough, white enough, I could try and it still wouldn't be just right enough because right keeps changing and I'm left sinking in the quicksand of a colorless culture. By now, you're waiting for me to finish because my words don't fit in the spaces you've reserved for strangers. You can't know that I'm a privileged stray, an antsy gypsy that wants to stay but can't, so I dance across the land with my necklace of stories, hoping you listen. I can't catch myself, so I catch metaphors instead. And when the fishing net comes out empty, I hold out my hands and weave a story with my fingers. This is the long version. You want to know where I'm from. I'm from the thoughts that forgot to make sense. I'm from a time that looks for excuses to slow down. I'm from a world where a conversation's population is a total of two, where you listen to me and I listen to you, and together we breathe in the music of this story. Can you hear it? It's the whisper of a coming monsoon.